I'm here.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. My name's Daniel Pryfogle. I'm the co-founder of Sympara, and this is the third session in our series, Congregational Death, Community Life. My conversation partner is Rick Mixon. Rick and I did this series. We offered this series last summer, and I would say for myself, Rick, you can weigh in here, but it's been a wonderful opportunity to come back to these themes, but given the history that we've experienced over the 9 months since last summer, in the midst of COVID and other pandemics. Last week, our theme was the peril and promise of death. And so we talked about a few things. We talked about the denial of institutional death. If we just stand firm, if we just got the right leadership, we're kind of some of the tone of that denial. We spoke of the stance of leadership that centers the denial, and the ego that's invested in keeping death at bay. I said no one wants a congregation to die on his or her watch, and Rick agreed with that and spoke of because the ego's on the line and it's regarded as a failure if that happens on your watch. So there's a lot of cultural pressure within the congregation, in the wider culture, to deny death at all cost. And because of that, a third thing that we touched on is that there's disconnections. The disconnect between vision and reality, the disconnect between the congregation and the wider community. This gulf just becomes wider and wider. So that was the bad news in the peril of death. But we also talked about the promise of death, the possibilities that come to a people in and through death. Rick quoted that hymn, "In the bulb there is a flower," and he also mentioned the words of Howard Thurman, "Look well to the growing edge." And so we talked about how losing life to find life means to let go of ego. To be less ego-driven is to open ourselves up to God's movement toward new life. We know this theologically. We know this philosophically. It is much more challenging to practice. And so that's really where we want to go today, to the practice of death. Last week we explored some metaphors for a congregation that embraces death, and we talked about a holding environment, and Rick suggested the possibility of a way station, a place that blesses people as they let go and move on. And so today we want to talk about, what are the rituals that are involved in that, in receiving people fully human as they are, which means dealing with death on a personal level, but then receiving them into an institution that is dying as well. How do we engage with each other? How do we talk with each other? What are the processes that help us accompany each other in that journey through death? So that's the stuff that we want to get into this week. Rick and I, once again, invite you to listen in on this conversation. It's a fishbowl kind of conversation where you get to hear us for about 35 minutes, talk to each other. And then we'll invite you to join the conversation by asking your questions or making comments through the chat function here on Zoom. We've teased over the last 2 weeks Rick's experience in Palo Alto, leading the First Baptist Church through a process of death and dying, um, to the point of closing, and then to the life that has continued and emerged on the other side of that, on the other side of that closure. So today we actually want to spend a little bit more time on that story, and give Rick the opportunity to talk about how the congregation came to embrace the reality of its death rather than denying it. Last week he touched on, early on in his time there. He was there in Palo Alto for 12 years. How the congregation was still working under the notion that it could turn this thing around. Um, but at some point, the church came to the realization that death was inevitable, and rather than being denied, it needed to be embraced. So, with that, Rick, I want to just hear the story a bit. How did the congregation come to embrace the reality of death? How did the congregation practice death together? Um, let's start there.
Yeah. Well, let me frame it this way. I really I don't we haven't focused, Daniel, in our conversation. We haven't. Are you having trouble hearing me?
You might just raise your volume a bit.
It's already on maximum.
Mm, lean in.
Yes, Alina, does that help?
Yeah, yeah, that's clear.
All right. Oh, maybe my cup's in front of my. I don't know. I'm at the. Um, I am old. Anyway, I think we haven't. I feel really focused on the. I mentioned this last week. The notion of how this whole issue is driven by fear of death, and and I think we could talk in the future, talk more about, unpack the whole issue of fear. Um, um, I shared with Daniel. I'll frame it one more this way. I shared with Daniel this morning this quotation from Richard Rohr's daily meditation. He quotes Eddie Hillesum, who was a young Jewish woman who was, executed at Auschwitz, who wrote like Anne Frank wrote, some beautiful reflections. But in the face of I can't imagine being in a concentration camp and facing death. And she comes to this conclusion. She says, by coming to terms with life, I mean the reality of death has become a definite part of my life. My life has, so to speak, been extended by death, by my looking death in the eye and accepting it, by accepting destruction as part of life and no longer wasting my energies on fear of death or the refusal to acknowledge its inevitability. It sounds paradoxical, but excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life. And by admitting death into our life, we enlarge and enrich life.
Mm,
I just that speaks to both the issue of fear and what we'll get to eventually in terms
yeah,
of the continuity of life.
yeah, so good.
But a piece of why that sticks out for me is in the Palo Alto story, there was a woman who was a key leader at the church for 50 years, Stanford grad with a master's from Union Seminary. She did our education. She was a force in the church. Um, And when I went there, I think I mentioned this. When I went there, I was called to facilitate this federation, which fell apart. And I soon discovered that I went with high hopes and expectations about the life of First Baptist Palo Alto. Some of it grounded in my experience from being an intern there 45 years earlier, um, and soon found out that it was much more fragmented than I had realized. That people were not of one accord, that people really were struggling. And looking back on it, I can say they really were struggling with end of life issues. Um, particular, I think I mentioned last week, this aging out of the leadership and no new leadership to take on these roles that some of them had been carrying for 20 years or more. Um, but Betsy, one of the fragmentations I discovered was that over 15 or 20 years prior to my coming, Betsy had been periodically saying we should close this church and sell the property and just go to, there are lots of progressive churches in Palo Alto. We can all go find another one. And, people had just turned their back on her. I mean, they had poo pooed that idea and said, oh, that's just Betsy. Um, and um, I won't say that her motivation was the most noble. In retrospect, I came to the conclusion that her urgency to close the church was her own inability to or her own willingness to feel her feelings, and she just did not want to have to live through watching the people she loved in the church and the church itself, which she also loved, um, uh, die off. And so let's just get this done and over with and wash our hands of it, and we'll move on. Um, but she did finally force the issue several years into my ministry there, and so we went through a process of discerning whether we wanted to try for renewal or to close the church, and about 60% of the people voted for renewal, not surprisingly. They just were not ready to let go. And but almost immediately I recognized that of that 60% that voted for renewal, maybe 10% really were interested in renewal. The others were really just, well, the catchword we used was, I want to be buried here.
Hmm.
I want my funeral to be here, so we can't close until you take care of the end of my life.
Wow. Yeah.
um, so that was an interesting phenomenon. The people just couldn't. It was just too painful to let go, and so we struggled along for several years, and one of the precipitants was we got into a battle with one of our major effort to try to renew the life of the church was was what we called the ministry of the building. And so we tried to fill the building with activities that
Hmm.
would serve what we called the welfare of the city. And we had some wonderful things going on, but of course our neighbors were not happy about all the activity. And of course, instead of working with us around it, they went to the city and complained. And we got into this big battle over what we were doing in the building and was it permissible, and could a church do those kinds of things. And the city, using a 1957 definition of church, said no, the activities we're doing did not qualify as religious or worship or religious education. And anyway, it was a big battle, and at the sort of the end of that battle, one of our sages said, um, isn't it time to get out from under this? And suddenly nobody said, oh, no, no, no. There was kind of silence in the room, and it was kind of like the writing on the wall saying, we're done. We have fought the good fight. We have made our best effort, and it's really time. And at that point, we brought in a consultant from the Center for Progressive Renewal to work with us on discerning our future. And indeed, their outcome was, this is not viable. You don't have the resources to continue this, and it's just time to let it go. And the guy that did the consultancy did a really thorough job. He interviewed some 50 people, and his research was solid. And so we were able to go to the church, and anybody who was trying, really hanging on, it's just, you have to face the diagnosis is here. The doctor has put it on paper, and
Rick,
so
once the congregation made that turn, um, what did you notice about folks and about
well,
yourself as leader
yeah.
as you gathered in death?
Well, it's a it's an interesting thing. When my own mother died at 97 and a half, my sister and I looked at each other and said, our primary emotion is relief. Um, and I think we discovered that. I mean, so look at the feeling aspect of it. There was a lot of relief from a lot of people. It's like, okay, we finally have acknowledged this reality, and now we can move forward with it. There was certainly sadness.
Mhm.
Um, there was grief. I mean, the church had a wonderful history. It had wonderful ministry. It's hard. It's painful to let go of that. We had a couple of key people who were really angry, and their anger was not directed. It was oblique.
Mm.
But from from with my psychological training, I was able to say, look, they're just, and both of them actually were born into the church, and it was the only church they'd ever known,
Mm.
and they were angry, and they were younger people, that is in their 40s and 50s, so they were among the younger people in the church, and they were
Mhm.
angry. So there was a breadth of sort of feeling responses that we had to acknowledge and process.
Say a little bit more about how you did that, how you made room, how you acknowledged that and made room for people to to feel whatever they were feeling, and how that perhaps showed up in the different practices and rituals of your life together.
Yeah, well, that's, part of it is that non-anxious presence, and my immediate, my as pastor, my immediate response is, oh no, I can't. Well, we can't have Chip, Chip, who was our primary volunteer, who did everything from
Mm.
running the sound to ushering. We can't have Chip angry, and anyway, it's like, you immediately want to make it all better. Isn't that
Yeah,
that's what
yeah,
pastors do, right? You got to
yeah,
fix this.
right.
And fortunately, I was wise enough, I guess, in my dotage to sit with it and not have to say, look, that's what they're experiencing, and I
Yeah,
don't think they're going to end up here, but
yeah.
I think that's what they're experiencing for now, and I think we just need to let that be, and not rush in and try to fix it. And there
Hmm.
were some people who really wanted to do that. And I think we needed to facilitate. We needed to certainly make some space for grieving, and
Hmm.
we had to make space for remembering, for sharing memories. So I mean,
Did the theme start showing up in worship?
hmm yeah. I mean that is a place where I have some control, right? So I made sure that it did.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
began to titrate the stuff that related to feelings and the winding down process into worship,
Yeah.
which by uh, not unusual these days. That's the one place where the community gathered
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
worship, and so that's the one opportunity to sort of try to address these things, or that was the major opportunity.
Skip forward in your story to a date was set for the last official service, um, and tell us what that experience was like in terms of preparing for that,
Yeah.
and then having that communal experience together.
Well, actually, there were two services. The last two, what we call formal worship services in the sanctuary. Um, they were at the end of July 2 summers ago,
Mhm.
and we knew that we there would be some ongoing life beyond that, but we were ending this time of formal It was it was a conscious decision we made. And so I actually crowdsourced what to do. I said, I don't know what to do with these last. I've never done this before.
Mm,
What do we do with these last services? And I got some good input from people, but in the process, I realized I need to do memorial services, and so that's what we did. I mean, literally, the penultimate service I talked about legacy, and I used the cloud of witnesses,
mm,
and the whole focus was about who we have been and who's been here and who we loved and what happened here. So it was really all about legacy.
mm,
And then literally the final service, did I used the template I would use for a memorial service.
mhm,
So we made space for grieving and remembering and embracing and saying goodbye.
mhm, mhm. Let's thank you for just taking us through that story. And there's so much more, uh, which I think everybody on this call appreciates. Um, but let's kind of walk back through the story in terms of identifying practices that are the what we might call the practice of death, the letting go, the letting come. Um, you and I've talked about, one kind of category for practice would be lament. Um, and so you've mentioned that this theme showed up in worship. You created space for people to express however they were feeling. So I hear a practice around honest conversations. I hear a practice around a kind of worship where people are invited to participate fully as they are, however they are.
Yeah.
What other practices of lament come to mind?
Well, lamentation. As you know, that's the subject of my dissertation. I
Mhm,
wrote 350 pages off of the whole notion of lamentation, which I picked up from Zola and connected to Lifton's notion
mhm,
that when we're faced with trauma, and the loss of your church could certainly be seen as a traumatic experience. Our initial response to trauma is to go numb,
yeah.
or is just to shut down.
Mhm,
And so the invitation to lamentation is an invitation to come out of that numbness, so that we can indeed at some point process further what's going on. And so I mean that's one way to frame the fact, the anger that Chip and Melanie felt. It was lamentation. It was, I mean,
mm,
that, and I my the fact that I know something about that helped me see that this is they're crying out.
mhm,
This
mhm,
is their means of crying out their pain.
mhm.
Other people were just sad, but you just you both in worship, but in relationship, you just have to keep making space for people to feel what they feel, and to
Yeah,
face their fears or their feelings, if you will.
right, right.
Right.
I I think of a second category of practices as liminal space, kind of just being
Right.
in that liminal space, that in between, abiding in that space. And so if we, last week I talked about Otto Schwarmer's um, theory U. So you have letting go coming down one side and letting come coming up the other side, but in between is this bottom that is the liminal space. So as the church made the decision to close, um, uh, individuals' lives would continue. Uh, the possibility of their relationships with each other, but there was probably a lot of uncertainty too. Like, where am I going to go to church next? Where are you going? Um, will
Mm-hmm.
we see each other as
Mm-hmm.
we see each other now?
Yeah.
So, what were the practices that helped people journey through that liminal space?
Well, um, let me share a couple of things that I was aware that of a of a UCC church that had closed in a neighboring town, and I'd heard this story about how the pastor, feeling in a kind of chaplain's role, had literally taken people, some especially older people from her church, around to different UCC churches in proximity to help them find a new church home. Which I thought, well, that's a lovely
Mm,
that's a lovely practice if you can make it happen, you know.
mhm,
And apparently she did that with some success. What we interestingly we went back to the connection to First Presbyterian that had been part of my job description when I came. We went back to that well. They had just called a fellow named Bruce Race Chow, which some of you may have heard of Bruce. He's a
mhm,
API author, youngest moderator ever the Presbyterian Church USA. Anyway, Bruce had just been called to that church, and we had actually done some work with Bruce as a consultant. And so I thought, well, geez, this is the terrific. They have this wonderful new pastor, and it's a great progressive church and like-minded people. And let's just say, any of our congregation that really want to stick together, let's move that group as a body to First Pres. So we did a couple of Sundays where we checked that out. Didn't work. People were not interested. Our one committed church person said, "No, that's not for me. Don't like his preaching. He doesn't preach like you." I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but
mhm.
anyway, she ended up joining this wonderful Episcopal church. Um, but yeah, we did try to shepherd that. We did people people found their own churches closer to home because it was something of a destination church. People said, just taking a break. Um, some people found a church across the street. There was a group that ended up at the other Presbyterian church in town. So um,
As I think about the liminal space that some of the folks on this call might be moving into in their own settings, um, I think of practices that help us handle uncertainty and um, again help us to let go. The comment that you made when it got to the point in the congregational discussion that where the you said the sage stood and said, "Isn't it time to get out from under this?" And then you said silence followed, and I think of that silence
hmm,
as a practice of liminality. I mean, what do you say if you know this to be true? If what he has just said uh, um, resonates at the depth of your soul. Silence itself is a practice of letting go. We can talk about Sabbath as a practice of letting go. The ways in which we might be invited to sit with Scripture, like in Lectio Divina, is in some sense a practice of letting go. Um, Basically, in all of these practices, I guess the common thread would be um, not forcing it, not not pushing it to be something other than it is. This is the reality that we're dealing with. This is the death that is upon us. This is the space that we are journeying through, this time of uncertainty. How then shall we live?
yeah.
Um,
Dan, I think that's right. I think I mean, it looks like most of the folks here today are pastors, pastoral leaders, and and in my own evolution in that role, I've come increasingly to appreciate silence and a willingness to sit with things.
Hmm.
That's a piece of that non-anxious presence, but
Yeah.
actually literally making space for it. I mean, I increasingly built some time for silence into the middle of the worship service,
Wow. Yeah.
just encouraging people, can we just sit and listen,
Hmm.
if you will, listen for this, wait for the Spirit to move in our lives, and that I think that was part of Betsy's push to close the church. She wasn't able to sit with the experience. She was anxious to get it done and over with. Let's
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people and you can't push that process. You have to. I think you have to let it unfold, or there are unhappy consequences of not letting it unfold in its own time.
Yes. Yes.
And so, I mean, you can say more about this, but the discipline, the discipline of looking for liminality,
Yeah.
it ought to be part of our pastoral toolkit, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Makes me think of, the Quakers are such good teachers of us, of silence. I think of the Quaker practice of being slow to speech.
hmm
That's speech is one of the ways we try to force things sometimes, and we just can't help ourselves. We've got to we think it's incumbent upon us to give some direction to the
yeah,
meeting, the experience. But they say be slow to speech. That involves some trust of others who share that space with you. That
absolutely.
that um, that maybe somebody else will feel the nudge of the spirit to say something. It's you don't have to speak.
Right.
Um, that takes some restraint and some trust for sure.
Yeah.
You Robert J. Lifton um, uh, speaks of the continuity of life. That's an important part of his project as it relates to dealing with death. Uh, and in your own leadership there in Palo Alto, as you made the turn to embracing death, as you practiced being in that liminal space together, you also, and maybe this, I'm doing something with my hand here, I'm coming back to that you also began to identify continuity of life,
Right.
and tied that specifically to the members' desires, their aspirations, their sense of meaning. Whether that was in helping church members find new homes, new opportunities for community, for connection, or in the legacy piece of this, making financial gifts to organizations that were key to the identities of members and key to their collective identity as a congregation.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Yeah. Lifton, and in some sense, he's a good pair to Becker and the denial of death, and both these guys are interested in us looking, we say in spiritual direction, taking what is a long loving look at the real, and so to take a long loving look at the real is to acknowledge the reality of death, as Eddie Hillesum does in that quote I read. um, but underneath, I mean, that's the bulb and the flower, the seed and the apple
Yeah.
tree. I mean, underneath there is this, what Lifton insists is this: there is a continuity to life. And his book, his classic book that I use, it's called The Broken Connection.
Mhm.
and it's partly about looking at death and death equivalents, but it's also about looking for the continuity of life. You know, I remember in college we sang a song about the rhythm of life is a powerful beat. Um, it's a it's a great pop song. But anyway, uh, uh, and I've loved. I mean, I love that image, the rhythm of life. I mean that maybe looking for liminality as a way of living into the rhythms of life. That death is part of it, but it isn't all of it. And so the discovery that we could find home other places, even at an old age, that people could still care for one another. They still could get together. They still could talk to one another. Uh, the relationships did not necessarily have to go away because that particular church one was going away. We met monthly for most of over a year. We met monthly, what we called all church gatherings, and so we did a check-in, we did an update on the process, and a little bit of worship by Zoom, um, well, live and then by Zoom, and it was a much different format, but it for the people who hung in with that, there was a different kind of connection that was life affirming. And and
Mhm.
then um, um, and then the big piece was, you know, once we were able to sell the building, and we've given away in excess of, or will given away in excess of $7 million before we're done. Um, oh my God, the letters. We're going to bind the letters that we're getting into a book and make it available to everybody in the congregation. So the who knew that that the affirmation of our legacy in the capacity to see our mission, our work go on would be so life giving. But it is. I mean, it's people, you know, our our one old Republican who said, you know, I want this money to go to the people who need it the most. I mean, the poorest of the poor, and you know, it's like, I mean, so that legacy is powerful and affirming that life goes on.
Yeah, yeah, it makes me think of that Whitman um, poem, "O Me, O Life," um, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse, so that there's even maybe even especially as they embraced death,
Yeah.
they could um, see clearly their legacy and the continuity to life.
Or like the last line of Angels in America, the great work begins
Yeah, right. Oh, I love that. Yeah. Mm,
out of the midst of it. And so I mean
yeah.
I mean that's the maybe the invitation for each of us is is whatever's going on uh, in the counterpoint, that there is a ground in this looking for the continuity of life and
Mhm,
bringing it forward in whatever we experience in our lives, in the lives of our people, in the life of our congregation.
mhm,
Right?
mhm. Yeah, that's so good. Well, we want to turn now to your questions and your comments. Um, we've got just a little under 20 minutes left here, and so we invite you to ask your questions, make your comments in the chat function here on Zoom, and then we'll field those as you post those. While you're thinking of questions or comments, I have a follow up question for Rick. You mentioned this theme of spiritual direction as taking a long, loving look at the real. Um, um, how you know, for those of on this call who are leading institutions, leading congregations now, and they're somewhere in this journey from life to death. Um, uh, what does a long, loving look at the real look like, um, that would not be nihilistic, that could still be hopeful? Um, I guess, how do you put the real and hopefulness together? And so I'll say one more thing. I remember preaching on death at a congregation that I served, and um, about the reality of death and the need to embrace death, all these things that we've been talking about. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, um, basically, we know we're dying, um, but we need to hear something hopeful. Um, so I received that, and it's why I ask you now: how do you take a long, loving look at the real that is neither nihilistic or
Mm,
denying of death?
mm. Yeah, well, Christina, I'm in complete agreement with her, with that parishioner. The older I get, I think the more I feel that. Um, I, my job is to hold hope.
Mm,
That to me, that's a key aspect of the pastoral role, is to be able to hold hope for myself and for others, and that's not always easy. And it's not always, it isn't necessarily, I mean, hope is not an absolute. Hope is, you know, there's a uncertainty to hope,
mhm, mhm.
as there's an uncertainty all this process, but you hold it. Um, and 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 in teaching pastoral care the last couple of years in the midst of the pandemic, that's the theme we come back to again and again in
Yeah,
the pastoral
yeah,
care class, is how do we hold hope? How do
yeah,
we hold hope for people?
yeah.
And I know, because I did the bulk of the spiritual direction program at San Francisco Theological Seminary. Beth Liebert, who was one of the founders or shapers of that program, she has a whole book on, whole framework on analyzing systems. So this long, loving look at the real is,
Mhm.
you know, you have to look at what's really going on in the world, and
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that, then you look for hope. I mean, you
Mhm,
look for what
mhm.
is hopeful, what is possible,
Yeah,
what can we do with this reality, what life comes out of death,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it becomes key to the enterprise.
I I I'm reminded of Walter Brueggemann's work on the prophetic imagination, and his just to boil this down, that there is a royal consciousness, this kind of dominant culture that we live under, and um, the work of prophets and a prophetic community is to somehow break out of that, to pierce that royal consciousness. Um, and hope then is something that is provided by the Spirit rather than manufactured by us. Um, Provided by the Spirit as the Spirit moves in community. And maybe this takes different forms, different shapes for us. In our very first session, as we talked about our personal experiences of death in the midst of congregational life, I mentioned the man who came up to me in the center of that congregation after worship and is the center of that sanctuary, and told me he'd never gotten over the death of his brother, who had also died at a young age.
Hmm.
And that to me was a gift of hope,
Hmm.
because I didn't have to pretend it was otherwise.
Hmm.
Um, and here was somebody who understood my pain, and that we could be in community together and continue the journey together with that knowledge, um, of the loss that had shaped shaped him profoundly and was shaping me profoundly in that moment. So hope was a gift provided by another member in that moment.
Yeah. Well, I keep thinking, Daniel, about what I think one of the sins of the church has has been to approach church life, to approach Christianity, to approach the gospel from a position of certainty, and to insist that we know what's going on instead of inviting people into a community. Keep thinking of the Rilke poem about loving the questions, embracing the
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, that's enough for now. Yeah, that's
That
right.
that that invitation to liminality, that invitation to sit with and to let hope emerge through the work of the Spirit,
Yeah, yeah,
becomes can become a really important part of church life or community life.
yes, indeed. David has asked a question here. He writes, "The church dies, but the people remain and have new possibilities." Taking the death metaphor another step, would we think about the former members of the church that died as the bereaved, the widowed, or even the survivors? What do you think?
Uh, the form
Would we think about the former members of the
oh,
church that died? We could
sure.
insert Palo Alto as the bereaved,
Oh yeah.
widowed, or even the survivors.
Yes, all of the above for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So if and as these people are passed on to another congregation, then maybe part of the process is ensuring that whoever is their new pastor, new person in that pastoral role, understands that these people are dealing with loss and grief, and need to be attended to in that way.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and even more the prophetic injunction uh, to to uh, to attend to the widows and the
Right.
orphans. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Um, Nancy's asked a question. What type of communication did you provide for the extended Palo Alto church community in this process? And then she comments that I was with my mother as she died over the period of about 6 weeks, and I blogged about um, the experience, which helped people not near, and because she couldn't really have a lot of visitors
Mm.
take that journey with her. So they heard about the ups and downs of the process of her dying and our journey with her. People were also able to respond uh, to those comments. So she's thinking that that could be helpful for a congregation.
Well,
So first question, what type of communication did you do with the extended church community?
up into the hmm, it's probably a combination, Nancy, of written and spoken communication. I do and I continued for well 20 years almost. I do a weekly e newsletter where I just either write about what's going on, or and then up until I guess around the time we stopped the formal worship, we also stopped our monthly newsletter where I would write maybe a couple of pages of reflection, and didn't shy away from the stuff we've been talking about in my and then in the preaching and worship, the same kind of thing. So those would have been the primary sources of communication. Although there were definitely conversations with individuals and groups around that as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think to your point, especially the story about your mom, is that I probably could have been more intentional about that,
Mm-hmm.
addressing some of the issues. I mean, this helps me to think about how I might have done it differently.
Peter's posted a comment. There's a good book titled Embracing Hopelessness by Miguel de la Torre.
Mm,
He talks about how often our churches and teaching hang on to false hope And
Yeah.
that keeps us from being the prophetic change agents the world really needs, versus accepting death and acting anyway.
Well, if you wanna deal with someone who is willing to, who is all about taking a long, loving look at the real, Miguel is is your.
Hmm.
I mean, he is passionate and outspoken about the realities that we inhabit.
Hmm.
He pulls no punches, and I haven't seen that book, Peter. So I'm gonna have to look for that
Yeah, I
book.
want to check that out as
That's
well.
that's really
Um,
interesting for somebody who's such a powerful critic to write about hope and the importance of holding hope.
hmm hmm
But that's that balance that we might discipline ourselves to try to live into.
Yeah, yeah,
How do we hold hope without skimping on the necessary critique?
yeah, yeah. And his title, "Embracing Hopelessness." I'm forgetting the words, but there's a T.S. Eliot poem that has lines. David Gregg's on this call, so he probably would remember this. Something about to hope without hoping. Um,
Yeah,
I'm gonna butcher it, but um,
yeah,
yeah, that it basically letting go of that false hope.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
it's Jesus crying out from the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Is he
mhm.
crying into the void, or is he crying into some fragment of a sense that there is still a presence there somewhere?
Yeah, yeah. Did you ever read Camus' The Plague?
Years ago.
Yeah. Do you remember the scene? You know, the two principal characters. One's a doctor, and one's I want to say is a reporter, a journalist. Um, but they're every day are taking care of the dead. They're living in death. They're practicing death. Um, but one evening in this oceanside village, they sit out on a balcony and feel the warm breeze coming off the ocean. Um, um, they don't deny the death that's all around them, but they also receive whatever the sea offers them, and then they go for a swim. Um, and it's this beautiful moment of swimming side by side, in sync, um, in this warm water that buoys them, that carries them out and then brings them back. Uh, they put their clothes back on and they go back to work. And the work is attending to the dying. Um, it just seems to me, consistent. Maybe I haven't read Miguel's book, but embracing hopelessness. We're not trying to engineer something here. We're not hanging on to false hope. Um, but we can receive the gifts that are still provided, that continuity of life, and at the same time keep walking through the death that is our reality.
But
How does that strike you, Rick?
one thought I have about that image, Daniel. I mean, I mentioned before, that I lived and worked pretty closely with people living with AIDS back in the day, and so it's like the plague, and like living now in a deathly environment, if you will. I was thinking the rhythm of that. You swim in, you swim out, except at some point you keep swimming out and you don't come back.
Mm-hmm,
So I mean,
hmm.
that's that rhythm. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
so either you come back or you don't. I don't know what to
Mm-hmm.
do with that, but uh,
David found the Eliot quote, T.S. Eliot. "I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope. For hope would be hope for the wrong thing.
hmm,
Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing. That's good.
And isn't that, I mean, again, isn't that that gift of liminality, of being willing to sit and wait for the Spirit
Mm,
to move?
hmm hmm
I love that. That's beautiful,
Yeah, it
Daniel.
sure is. Nancy's asked the question back, back to your story of when the one gentleman stood and said, um, "Isn't it time to get out from under this?" Uh, what had turned or happened um, when this individual stood up and said that?
Well, the presenting problem, the presenting thing, Nancy, was this battle with the city. We
Mm-hmm,
had, I mean, in some ways, it was my finest moment. My defense of the church against the city of Palo Alto. I wrote and said some eloquent things. In defending the church and the life of the church, and the possibility of church beyond what we thought we knew. Um, but it was at that point. It was we were up against a brick wall, and it just was a recognition we don't have the energy to keep fighting this.
yeah, it was kind of the last straw, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I probably could have kept it going, but it's not and should not be a solitary enterprise.
Yeah, yeah,
If
indeed.
there weren't people, in the congregation that were, and I was really carrying it, so to some certain degree anyway. So
Rick, in the seconds that we have left, um, uh, what questions need more conversation? Like we're coming to the end of this hour, our third hour in this series. Um, what questions need more conversation? You said at the outset that we probably need more conversation about fear.
yeah, I mean, we've started to unpack this today. And yeah, I mean, the two things that really stick, two or three things that really stick in my head. One is just is being willing to look more deeply at what we're of that of which we are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
I think of uh, the wonder Audre Lorde's wonderful little speech essay, "The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action," and
Mm-hmm.
that our silence won't save us from the things we're afraid of. We need to look at the things we're afraid of. I think that's really important.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and then as we've unfolded today, the notion of what does it mean for a church to live willingly, consciously, intentionally with uncertainty?
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
That's
to be willing to sit and to let the Spirit move in our lives.
yes,
And
yes. So countercultural,
yeah,
um, and countercultural in indeed in faith
oh yeah,
communities.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
and so we're all about size and growth, but what if that's not what it's about? What if
yeah.
that's not what the gospel is about? Which
Yeah.
I
That's right. That's right. Rick, I'm so grateful that you and I have had the opportunity to have this
yeah,
conversation again. And I'm grateful to all who were present for these three sessions. Um, we have recorded each session and are posting those links to the event page on the Sympara website, sympara.org. We've got other events coming up this summer, so I encourage you to follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn and check back periodically to the website. If you're not on our mailing list, just go to sympara.org and sign up, and we'll make sure that you get our newsletter and other information that we periodically send out. Um, Wherever you are on your journey as it relates to death and life. Rick and I wish you blessings. And thanks again for being part of this conversation. Take care, everybody.
Bye.